let me know if Russ needs to be spotted on the grill. All right. Okay. So tell us your name first.
Dennis Redmoon Darkeem.
And how did you get involved with Guttenberg Arts and the Made Here exhibition?
I applied to their residency program, and I was selected. And once I was selected, had a couple of ideas of works that I wanted to, projects I wanted to work on. But the last couple of 3 weeks, I kind of figured out what I wanted to display and show, and this is the work that you see up right now.
Do you want to just take a moment leading us through some of it and describing it if you can? I know that's not easy,
okay,
but for your own work, it might be a little easier.
Got you. So my works, there's two things that my two goals that I have when I create work is how do I embrace my cultural background, and also how do I use found objects to create fine art. And so what you see is a lot of work is found materials. I use a lot, so the idea of painting. These are paintings mixed with collage and ink work, along with using items like envelopes, mirrors, clipboards, found wood, old jewelry, and the idea is how do I transform these things to create a new narrative of my historic background.
So what is the narrative, by the way? Tell us the narrative.
It's the idea of my family is Yamasee Seminole from Florida and African American. So how do I mix those two narratives to create fine art? And that's what my work is about. Taking these two historic narratives and kind of using social issues, political issues to try to kind of transform a narrative of identity within my work. So allowing viewers to find something that relates to themselves in my work.
So what would you call the seminal aspects, by the way? Is this traditional dress over here? And what would be the African elements?
So the mixing of narratives when it comes to cultural background. So the Seminole, the word Seminole means runaway. So the idea, the mixing of runaway slaves with indigenous culture is kind of the narrative of my work, and how do I continue this legacy of a culture that's kind of that's been told that it's non-existent or no longer. So through my work, I try to create a visibility of indigenous and African culture that combines. So my narrative would be that, what would indigenous and African work look like? So that's how I kind of wrap my work up in that narrative.
And so again, the materials, there's a collage element to the work as well. But then these particular patterns that we're seeing in here, is there anything about these that adds to the narrative, that tells the story as well?
So I use a lot of symbolism that contains to my tribal affiliation, my clan affiliation, my social, religious, or cultural. So all of these kind of different isms, I kind of create symbolism that kind of give voice to these different narratives that make up me, of who I am. So my religion, my cultural aspects, certain rituals, traditions that I practice, I try to blend that all within my work with using colors and symbolism to kind of reflect that.
So with the intersection of so many things going on, how do you find yourself in the midst of all that? There seems to be a lot of things, a lot of streams that add up to you. So when did you first become aware of all of this, and when did you first think of trying to figure out what all these different streams were and where they led back to?
Oh, wow. I think as a child, I always had this information. I always had this narrative. It's just, how do I find this narrative to place within society, to find my voice within society, and kind of try to look beyond advertisements and all these other ways, all these things to tell me who I am, to actually the richness of my culture. And so with that, I also acknowledge that that always changes. So depending on where I travel, where I work, materials I use, these narrative changes within time. So it's an evolving idea of identity. So as I get older, the more I grow, the more I realize like things that I'm very excited or that are very important to me. I realize that they change within time, and new things become important. But it all starts with one narrative, and that kind of leads the way of like the understanding of like what my identity at that moment in time and place and now is.
Let's talk about this other work as well. There's another wall of work, and this is a little more figural, if you will. There's a sculpture element to it as well. What are these signposts? They look like they're pointing different ways. So is that intentional, or are they sticks? What are those?
So these are actually most indigenous people on the East Coast. Before guns, we use something called war clubs, and these are inspired by war clubs that kind of create a story, a dialogue, and narrative. So the first piece represents the idea of when nature takes its course, so the idea of us being underwater one day, that is a possibility. So getting hit with that, how do you accept that? And that's kind of war clubs. It's this weird line that I'm playing with the idea of protection, armor, consciousness, but the idea of these are taking something that was used to like defend, but more or less to be a narrative for today's identity and culture. How do we survive?
So that's the top one. Do you want to explain any of these other ones as well?
So they all kind of create a storyline. Each individual has a storyline. It talks about the idea of drinking and like pigeons, and kind of goes from like the idea of one time we had to hunt for food, where we can actually get fast food, but kind of where does it end up leaving us in the grave? So all of these kind of create like a narrative and a story when you put them together.
And what is the material?
So this is wood. These are fine nails, upholstery nails, black and gold ink on wood, cut wood. Yeah.
And are they supposed to be displayed as a group? The power comes from the group?
For this exhibit itself, I created this piece as a narrative of a dialogue, but they can live solo pieces and in its own way.
Let's talk about this last assemblage as well. These are quite lovely.
Thank you. So these are collages on wood, cut wood. So thinking about the lifespan of wood and the narrative of how culture and migration and immigration kind of connects. So that connection between wood, something natural that grows and has its own history, but also like through travel and like migrating and like emerging together, the idea of how does one's narrative or one's historic background changes. So this is about the idea of like finding oneself within imagery and a historic narrative.
And is there any part of it that's also about explaining your background to yourself? Any part of this that's self-discovery, for instance?
Yeah, so this has a little bit of everything. It has an idea of religion, cultural background, survival, mix of all. The idea of using certain symbols of the shells kind of reflects a location. So I'm using wampum shells. Wampum is something that you would find the Northeast. Many tribes on the Northeast would use wampum as currency, wampum to adorn themselves. The same thing with abalone shell and pearl. So these elements are very significant to many cultures or people within the East Coast, focusing on indigenous people and the people who blended and mixed with them, and how these items actually created dialogues of connection.
Tell us your name one more time.
Dennis Redmoon Darkeem.
And Dennis is hanging right now in the Made Here exhibition at Guttenberg Arts. It was good to talk to you. Thank you for speaking with me. I've got one more artist to speak with.